Good morning. Can you hear me in the back? Do you want to? Thank you very much, Terry, for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for the opportunity to share with you a few ideas based on research we've been doing over the last decade and a half on how the rules of business success keep changing and how our organizations can take advantage of those changes rather than be victimized by them. I'm often challenged to summarize in a sentence, a phrase, or preferably a single word what all of this research is about. I always failed and lost my motivation to try when I heard the following apparently true story. When Mikhail Gorbachev was still running the Soviet Union, he was challenged by a young financial journalist to summarize the state of the Soviet economy with just one word. Gorby's English was okay, not great. He felt uncomfortable, and he said, if I could use one word to describe the Soviet economy, I'd say the Soviet economy is good. Somehow this wasn't the level of insight that the journalist was looking for, so she said, okay, Mr. First Secretary, why don't you use two words to describe the Soviet economy? And Gorbachev smiled, because now he could communicate exactly what he wanted to. If I could use two words, I would say the Soviet economy is not good. The prophetic Gorbachev could have been talking about the economic and business challenges that we are faced with dealing with over the next 3 years. And we will experience, as the economy has experienced dozens of times before, yet again a process of value migration where value moves from old business designs and old business models to new business designs that do a much, much better job of understanding how the customer is changing, not only in terms of preferences, but in terms of power, and building not just great products and processes, but great business models that enable them to add value and to be rewarded for it. We've seen this play out across dozens of industries, and depending on the industry, the value loss can be in the billions or the tens of billions of dollars as value shifts from old business models to new. This discipline of value migration is about answering three questions better than our competitors. Where will we as suppliers be allowed to create profitability in our industry in the future? What is it about how the customer is changing in preference and in power relative to us? And what next generation business design do we have to build to capture and protect that profitability? This process doesn't play out randomly, but in certain well-defined patterns, one of the most difficult of which is the evolution of an industry, a value chain, or part of a value chain to become a no-profit zone, an arena where suppliers, by and large, are not allowed to create profitability. Doesn't matter whether you cut the airline data on a 20-year cycle or a 10-year cycle, net profitability has been negative. When we first developed this example, it was often misused as the exception. Is it the exception? Or are there other no-profit zones that you see outside your own industry? Any takers? Other no-profit zones? I knew it was too early for this question. So let me ask you, are you familiar with newspapers? Are you familiar with the music industry? Are you familiar with consumer electronics? Margins once 15%, now 2%. Familiar with cars? I'll ask you a few things this morning to take back and talk about with your management teams. And that question of what are the no-profit zones out there outside our own industry is one of them. And then shift to what might be the no-profit zones that we should anticipate within our own industry. Far from being the exception, no-profit zones are incredibly prevalent, in fact growing, and they affect not just businesses in distress. If I ask you to focus on the first bullet point in the second column, what's the most powerful brand in the world? Any takers? People still say Coca-Cola. What's Coca-Cola's largest single line of business? It's selling carbonated beverages to grocers in the United States. How much money does Coke make in its single largest line of business? In a typical year, Coke makes about $6 billion in profit. 85% is international. There are three big businesses in the US: grocery, fountain, and vending. Anyone bought Coke in a vending machine lately? How much did you pay cents per ounce? No calculators, please. Common answer is about 10 cents, good average. Anyone bought Coke in a restaurant lately? McDonald's, Wendy's, fine French restaurant. How much did you pay cents per ounce? This is not a precision exercise. Most people say 10 to 12 cents, and if you ask them, are you adjusting for the ice? They'd say about 25 cents an ounce. Anyone bought Coke in a grocery store lately? Can or 2-liter bottle? $0.015 to 2.5 cents an ounce. Most powerful brand in the world, delightfully non-technology risk product, older than any three of us in the room, running a no-profit zone in its largest line of business. Can Coke walk away from that business? Absolutely not. And they've brilliantly redesigned around it, but they made absolutely certain that they maximized their investments in the high-profit spaces. Their share in grocery is 1-to-1, in vending 3-to-1, in fountain 4-to-1, in international it's 5-to-1. Are there any no-profit zones that we have in our business today? Are any of them emerging in the next 3 years? If we can walk away, should we? If we can't walk away, what do we do to design around it? Or, in the best of cases, and some people have actually done this, reverse a no-profit zone. Awfully difficult to do, but it has been done. The point of talking about Coke is all of us are Coke. All of us have a grocery-type business, a vending-type business, a restaurant-type business where profitability is extremely uneven. In the last 10 to 15 years, having an X-ray of our own profitability, understanding where it happens and where it doesn't, was not that critical in a world of high utilization and fee-for-service reimbursement. In the next 3 years, it'll become extremely important to understand where we make our money, why we make it, and what investments do we need to make to sustain that into the future. The other reason that's true is because market share, which used to be the single most important idea in business, has become the trickiest idea in business. It used to be that if we gained the highest market share, we would have the highest profitability. This was my favorite picture in business school because it told me, Adrian, if you're a good boy, invested to create a leadership position, you would be rewarded not only with profitability, but profitability in direct proportion to your leadership position. You can imagine how upset I was when a little while later the proportionality was still perfect, but went the other way, and then it didn't matter whether you were big, medium, or small, nobody made money. Why do we care about this in healthcare? Today, there is a tremendous amount of consolidation to develop market share on a local or regional basis. Today is a good time to ask whether that strategy, which may have worked in the past, will continue to work in a CalPERS, Walmart, Castlight kind of world with greater transparency and very, very different types of payer behavior. The bottom line of value migration is to insistently keep asking ourselves one question. What's the business design that made us successful till now? How much economic life does it have? And what's the next business design that we want to move our organization to continue our success into the future? We know intuitively what a business design is. At the strategic level, it's 5 very simple to say and very difficult to answer questions. Who are the customers that I'll serve and which ones will I not? What's my unique value proposition? Why do they buy from me rather than from others? What's my profit model? How do we make money from our transactions or relationships? The hardest, strategic control. How do we protect our profitability, not only against competitor imitation, but growing customer power? And then finally, scope and alliances. What do we do ourselves versus where do we partner with others? How much economic life is left in my model today? When do I need to move to the next one? And what's the shape of the next business model for me? People liked value migration because it was explanatory, it was prescriptive, but they were hoping that it would slow down or frankly go away. It's done the opposite. It's accelerated and it's become more complex and more challenging, and it has taken us to look at industries beyond our own to try to understand what's happening. It's begun to affect not just one industry, but clusters of industries at the same time. There used to be a world with a technology value chain with hardware and software providers that we all know well, and a telco value chain with people like AT&T, Verizon, Motorola, and Nokia, a media value chain, Disney, Viacom, and the others, and a consumer electronics value chain, Sony, Panasonic, Toshiba. Something strange happened about 10 years ago. Is Google a tech company, a telco, a media company, a consumer device company? Is Amazon a tech company, a telco, a media company, a consumer device company? Ditto for Apple, ditto for Bloomberg, ditto for the others. But the strange thing that happened is most of the initiative came from the people who started in the tech value chain, but who thought of themselves and who thought about business differently. They didn't care where they came from, they cared about something else. They asked the question, what's the hassle map of the customer? And how can I connect the dots from wherever it takes, hardware, software, information, etc., to solve that hassle map in a radical and elegant way? And they started doing this across dozens of our experiences, and we've all been the beneficiaries of it. Here's one that has almost been forgotten. Do you remember that date 10 years ago on a Saturday afternoon when you had to go to Blockbuster to rent movies for Saturday night? This is how the process started. Fight with spouse. What movie do you want to see? I don't know, you decide. Go to the store, search and search. Being risk averse, pick 3 and hope one of them works. Come back, fight some more, watch, forget to bring it back, pay a huge fee. Reed Hastings put himself literally in our shoes, saw the world through our eyes and our emotions, and many people in this room have experienced the difference between the Saturday night fights and find out in advance, get in the queue, get it in the mail, put it back in the mail, and we were happy, but Reed wasn't, because he considered that a hassle-full map as well and continued pushing till he got to the next stage. You've had this experience in video, you've had this experience in books and retail, you've had this experience with music and dozens of other categories. What's the hassle map of the customer, and how do we connect the dots to solve that map in a radical and elegant way? And one more thing. They weren't satisfied with just getting a functional solution. They asked themselves a very, very tough question. Is our offer to the customer very good, or is it magnetic? What's magnetic? Well, this is the most complex equation you'll see in the presentation, but it is very simple. Magnetic is the best functionality provided to the consumer in our industry times the strongest emotional connection. Best functionality times the strongest emotional connection. This works in B2C, it also works in B2B. Any of you who are familiar with traders, financial traders 10 or 12 years ago, knew what a hassle their life was. Different sources of data, different logins, different prices, data not comparable. Along comes Mike Bloomberg, reverses all of those things and literally creates a product, a service, an offer that every trader loves and cannot live without. Important thing to notice, however, both in the tech and in this example, in addition to the evolution towards hassle map fixing, there has been an evolution to a much more consumer-centric view of the world, even in B2B. Bloomberg sells into the B2B world, but is obsessed with the individuals there and treats them as consumers and wins as a result. Why do the traders love it? Not only because it has improved dramatically and because it saves them hours every day and errors every day, but they basically have all that they need at their fingertips. If I'm a physician or if I'm a nurse practitioner, do I have that today? Still hasn't come. There are several candidates who could do it, but what would our physicians, our practitioners, our clinicians say if they had this kind of informational and analytical power at their fingertips the way the financial traders do? A funny thing happens when value migration begins. It is not a zero-sum game. In fact, the value universe tends to expand. In 1990, at the beginning of the Microsoft era, the value, not the revenue or volume, but the value of the tech sector was around $250 billion. In 2005, it grew to 1.9. In 2014, it grew to 4. And if you add the neighboring value chains, you have a value space of nearly $7 trillion. This has happened to varying degrees across many industries. Remember, in retail, the days of Sears and Walmart and JCPenney and the department stores, if you added up all the value of all of those business models, it was about $200 billion. Today, it's close to $1 trillion and growing quickly. In materials, the value expansion was moderate. In retail, it was enormous. In tech, it was huge. One of the things that happens and is really important for incumbents to focus on is that the value universe expands. I want to see not just the downside, but also the upside. But the downside is there, because not only does the universe expand, but there are dramatic value shifts within it. If you look at the four-chain world of tech, telco, media, and consumer devices, and just look at the top 21 valued companies in 2000, in the aggregate, they were worth $2.6 trillion. The 11 small cross-chain players at the time, Bloomberg, Apple, Samsung, and others, were worth only $80 billion. They had 3% of the value. Within a decade, the incumbents lost $1 trillion. The cross-chain players gained $1 trillion and gained a significant share of the value. When value migrates, the value universe expands. It presents an enormous opportunity for newcomers, but it represents an enormous opportunity for incumbents as well. But it means thinking in a different way, starting with the customer, easiest thing to say, hardest thing to do, and asking who owns, who best understands the hassle map, who can connect the dots to fix it, and who is improving most quickly. But value migration brings tremendously tough moments even to the most successful organizations. It's 2004 and ebook technology emerges. You are Sony, you look at it, and what do you say? You say, ah, a cool device. You are Amazon, and you've spent a decade building a system that can get anybody a book in 48 hours, a system full of warehouses and websites, and what do you say? You look at this device, you add a mobile capability, and you can see something that can kill your business. To their credit, Amazon also saw a huge opportunity to improve our value to the customer. Value migration is tough for people who are experiencing it for the first time. Amazon experiences it every 4 or 5 years. And they constantly ask themselves, because of that, what new things will my team have to learn in the next 3 years? And that may be a question that we bring to our teams as well. What was tough for Amazon and the others is that boundaries that helped to protect and explain what was going on were blurring. Amazon was a website and warehouse manager. There was a boundary between them and consumer devices. The boundary fell, they had to learn it. But learn it they did, and they represent, and I won't talk about more than these 4, a set of incumbents who were faced with these moments of crisis, who thought differently and came out in a very different position. You can see around 2004, when the first e-readers came out, there was a significant crisis at Amazon. They started a lab, filled it with engineers, and within 18 months came out with a great device of their own. We tend to forget that the king of the hill in consumer devices was Sony, and that Apple was a distant second. In fact, most of us thought that Apple would be dead, 2% PC market share and declining. In fact, their embrace of hassle map thinking, connecting the dots, and creating the offer led to the exact opposite. IBM's travails we know, and we know that there were not just 7 lean years, but 7 bad years as they struggled to understand how the world had changed and built the right next business design. And a lot of the reason for the conversation for today is to help us avoid this 6 or 7 year period and move directly to the long-term value creation that IBM achieved. And finally, all of us know that Samsung was stuck in commodity hell up until 97, 98, until they too saw the changes that were happening in the marketplace, aggressively reacted, and have been creating enormous value ever since. When you look at this data, why did some incumbents win while others failed? First reason is they allowed themselves to look at the facts, to look at the data, to take off their traditional success model and to see what's going on. Secondly, they allowed themselves to see not just the downside that they were facing, but the upside. The value universe is expanding. Thirdly, they knew they had to play defense, but they made sure that their ratio was 30% defense and 70% offense to make sure their mind was into the future. And finally, they created a sense of urgency that the organization had never seen and didn't need in the past, but needed today. Now, urgency is a funny thing. I had a chance to talk about this to a group of media executives, and I said, you know, in comparison to media, the tech folks have kind of a digital watch, and you maybe have kind of a grandfather clock. And it was a risky thing to say, but then somebody at the back of the room violently disagreed and said, Adrian, no, that's not right. It's not a grandfather clock. It's actually much more like a sundial. And then somebody else said, no, that's not true at all. It's not sundial, it's Salvador Dali's persistence of memory. It's a thing you can't see, it's a thing you can't touch. But especially for incumbents with large organizations and large assets, changing the rate of metabolism of the organization and directing it to the right target makes all the difference in the world. The 4-chain world has had a fascinating first decade, but it's only the first half of the game. The second half of the game is beginning. In the first half, it was mostly tech company initiatives taking value from telcos, consumer, and media companies. Now the game is different. Now it is King Kong against Godzilla. It is Apple versus Google. It is Apple versus Amazon. It is Facebook versus Google. And why do we care? For two very, very straightforward reasons. The first is they continue coming up with new techniques and ideas and ways of thinking that can be helpful to us. But the second reason is having captured a lot of value from their direct neighbors, they want to go further. They want our value and they want our customers. The big difference, because technology has always been prominent in healthcare, but it has been prominent as companies that sell tools to healthcare players. Here we're beginning to enter a phase where the technology players actually want to build and protect and expand the direct relationship with the customer. When we think about healthcare over the next 3 to 5 years, a few things will happen. Competition will no longer be just within healthcare. Are there hassle maps in healthcare that are valuable to fix? What might happen to capacity? What might happen to our compete-collaborate ratio? And are there, in fact, opportunities to build great new business designs? If we look at the tech space, we've seen for several years that enormous players like IBM, Google, Apple, and Samsung have been investing heavily here, and it's accelerated. There are tens of thousands of apps in the Apple and the Android ecosystem. Watson was the leader in cognitive computing, still is, but Google recently hired Ray Kurzweil, famous, no kidding, inventor and futurologist, to head a team at Google whose purpose is to develop cognitive computing to compete with IBM's Watson. But what has been perhaps the most surprising in the last 3 years is the intensity with which the venture capital community has multiplied its investments in startups, both in number of scale deals and in a funding rate that is growing at 30% a year. And what's important about this is not just the scale and the momentum, but the critical mass per company. There are dozens who have received $25, $50 to $100 million in investment. The fact that all of these companies are in some way responding to consumers who can't get questions or services answered by the system today, and most importantly, by the fact that they are moving at silicon speed. On the other side of the healthcare map is retail, a set of very large companies in revenue, a set of very large companies in value. But it's worth asking, what is retail? And one answer that might be counterintuitive but important is it's $1 trillion looking for growth. In the past, the pharmacy chains solved the growth problem with cosmetics. The discounters did with grocery. That's used up, and now they are looking at us. And the mistake that incumbent players can make is to look at the pharmacy chains as they started or as they are today, as opposed to how they will evolve over the last 2 to 3 years. Just out of curiosity, who has gone to a pharmacy chain to visit the nurse practitioner for any reason? Wow. For those of you who haven't, please go and experience it yourself and come away both with your critique but also your anticipation of how steep this curve will be over the next 2 to 3 years. We sit in the middle between a neighbor on the north and a neighbor on the south. The neighbor on the north loves hassle maps and loves to fix them. The neighbor on the south loves high costs and has made a career of reducing costs by 40 to 50% and getting great volume growth. I don't think healthcare will be a single value chain any longer. The question is, are there any hassle maps in healthcare? It's an interesting question. I sat down with a physician friend of mine for about 45 minutes or so and said, let's look at things from the point of view of the patient. Let's look at things from the point of view of the physician. Let's look at things from the point of view of the payer. And boy, there was no shortage. And he exclaimed, this is the worst hassle map in the world. And I said, you know, that's nice to say, but it's not really true. The worst hassle map in the world is our counterinsurgency hassle map in Afghanistan, which many of you saw on the front page of the Times 2 or 3 years ago. But if you speak to enough people, they do think of healthcare as hassle map heaven. And let me just give a tiny slice of what that means from the point of view of the individual. Ellen is 82 years old. She has congestive heart failure. One morning, she wakes up, she goes to her wireless scale, which her clinic provided to her, gets on the scale, sees that she gained 3.5 pounds, is a little troubled, goes to the kitchen to make her breakfast, and the phone rings. The phone rings from her clinic, Caremore, and the nurse said, Ellen, you've gained 3.5 pounds. That probably means you may have fluid buildup in the lungs. You have to come to the clinic this morning. And Ellen says, I'm sorry, my daughter's away. She can't take me. And the nurse says, we'll send a car for you. Ellen comes into the clinic. She is immediately put on a treatment plan. And by the 7th day, she is out of danger. Ellen's experience is not typical for the congestive heart failure patient. For the typical patient, there is a delay because there is no wireless scale at home connected to a clinic. By week 2, the problem is terrible. There's a call to 911, the emergency room, and the consequences can be pretty bad. Impaired quality of life, very expensive, and ongoing expense. In the case of Ellen, she was treated and addressed in the same day, and by day 7, the crisis had passed. At Caremore and at other clinics like it, the ability to focus on connected and preventive care has in this case reduced CHF readmissions by 56%. For Dan, who is 87 years old and very prone to fall, in the Caremore system, falls have been reduced for the frail elderly by 80%. For Joe, who is a diabetic and who banged his leg and was in the traditional system, someone who is at risk of amputation, amputations in the Caremore system reduced by 60%. Caremore is part of a fascinating class of organizations that are obsessed with connected preventive care. They include Caremore Healthcare Partners, IORA, Q-Lions in Seattle, South Central Foundation in Alaska, Camden Coalition in New Jersey, Leon in Florida, and others. But they are the exception not the rule, but that exception is growing, and it is growing quickly. Whether you look at PCMHs or whether you look at ACOs, we now have close to 80 to 100,000 physicians and clinicians learning how to make a living, not in a fee-for-service world, but in a share-gaining or fixed payment world. There is tremendous variability behind these numbers, tremendous variability in clinical performance and in business performance. And unfortunately, many are finding out that great clinical delivery without having the right negotiation and the right business model with it is the sound of one hand clapping. But it's a good realization because they are learning that our negotiating professionals and our contracting team has to be as brilliant as our surgeons. And whether we have to select or train or hire from outside the industry, if we don't do that, we will not be rewarded for the great clinical results we are delivering, and we will not have the profitability that we need to reinvest in the next level of layer. But the growth of retail and care teams is doing a couple of interesting things to capacity over the next 3 years. Retail is freeing up a lot of time for physicians, and the rapid growth of retail means that that will increase in the next 3 years. Physicians who are moving into medical homes or care teams are accomplishing something pretty universally across the country, and that is reducing hospital utilization and specialist utilization because of the focus on connected and preventive care. And specialists are also beginning to join and lead care teams. Sheldon Zinberg, after all, the founder of CareMore, was a gastroenterologist who did this par excellence. Today, 2014 is a very important time for the leaders in the system to ask the question, given these changes, how much do we expect utilization to decline in the next 3 years, and how much do we expect price to decline? We've done our own modeling. Please do yours, because the answer to that question will determine how rapidly we have to improve our productivity in the next 24 to 36 months, and how rapidly we have to build new, less asset-intensive, higher margin businesses to help us manage through the transition. However we slice it, the competitive intensity within the health value chain and with the pressure from tech and retail will go up. When value migration happens, days of high growth and days of high margin flip to a period of margin decline, and always, 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 industries at some point begin to collaborate where it's legal to counteract that economic pressure. But almost always, with very few exceptions, that collaboration starts 10 years too late. Today is the perfect time to ask the question for us, what is our compete-collaborate ratio? When growth is high and margins are great, a ratio of 100 to 0 makes perfect sense. But when crisis begins, being the first or being early to identify where should we be collaborating with our peers, with our competitors, becomes critical. And the best people who have done it start the process with a very straightforward question. Where do we allocate capital and attention and emotional energy to activities that give us no differentiation and add no new value for the customer? Your situation is different from that of other industries, because in other industries where it's done successfully, Airbus, for example, or Sematech, the collaboration is within the value chain. In health, it's a different picture, because there are opportunities to collaborate inside the value chain, but there are also tremendous opportunities to collaborate across it. The newcomers really do want to capture and create a lot of new value, but many of them don't know healthcare as well as you do. The opportunities to find the right partners and create new value with them have never been greater, without minimizing for a second how difficult that challenge is. But people have overcome that challenge. Anyone remember the iPod? When it came out, everybody said, what a great design. And then they sold a few 100,000 units. It was Steve Jobs on his knees for 18 months working with the music companies to enable the creation of the music store that then allowed the iPod to take off. In the tech world, there are great examples. Apple and Samsung. Samsung is one of Apple's biggest suppliers, and as you know, they are their fiercest rival, next to Google, of course. Very, very hard skill to learn, critical for success in the next phase of this industry. Technology has always been a part of healthcare. It is growing in its importance in healthcare, but technology is blind. Technology doesn't care who it destroys, who it helps. It is addicted to improving, and it is an equal opportunity destroyer and creator. The best business designers look at technology in a very unusual way. They ask the question, how can new technologies help us do a much, much better job of customer selection, of finding the right customers for us to serve and not try to serve everybody? How can technology enable us to build a dramatically better value proposition, not just on process and service, but on information as well? Can technology help us to build a unique profit model? And people have started to do that already. But perhaps most importantly, how can technology and the connections that it creates help us build a much, much more powerful mode of strategic control to help us protect the profitability we create against competitors and customer power? And profitability is a very, very tough term. You say the word profit, and for a lot of people, it means greed. But for other people who are more thoughtful, it means one very simple thing, and that is the resources to reinvest in creating new value for the customer tomorrow. People who actually do this and figure out what it is today and what the next one should be will often tell you thinking about this gives you a migraine headache. But that's when you know that it's working. And then they go one further step and say the following. When you do this, follow one rule. When you're thinking about tomorrow's business design, challenge yourself and your team to come up with at least 3 alternatives for what that could be. Don't go to the default position. Because what they have found is if you force yourself to invent 3 or 4 alternatives, you will find that the default one may be okay, the second one might be very good, but the third or the fourth can literally be worth 5 times as much as the business position today. What are 3 alternatives for our business design of tomorrow? And that's a question not just for the incumbents in the industry, but it's a question for the newcomers and everybody in the game as well. IBM has a great technology in Watson. It can choose the typical business model of being a technology licensor, and you can calculate how valuable that would be, or it can try to do something else and evolve it into the Bloomberg for health professionals. And there are alternatives 3 and 4. The Apple Watch is a cool device, and it will make Apple a lot of money, but how valuable will it be compared to a situation where Apple creates an ecosystem that really delivers health value to consumers? The early indications are that they're trying for column 2. We won't know for 15 to 18 months whether they will have what it takes to pull it off. A care team. The care teams of today focus on medium-term prevention. They do a great job. They reduce hospitalization. They reduce specialist usage. But there is a second-generation care team just around the corner that invests in biosensors, big data, Watson, genomics, coaches, and whose objective is not just to keep you out of the hospital, but it is to give you 10 to 20 years, not of longer life, but of good years of living in the life that you have. Hospitals, many are focused on cost-cutting and consolidation. An alternative model is partnering with and co-creating smart care teams, and we'll look at the economics of that in a second. Pharmacies are doing great with clinics, but there's a very radically different alternative, which is clinic plus telehealth plus health coaches plus care teams, either owned or allied. And for payers, they can continue to be reimbursement, underwriting-driven insurers, or an alternative model is a consumer health company. As you work through the data very often, column number 2 may have a value that is 3 to 5 times greater than column number 1. The industry has not had a tradition or a history of business model innovation because it didn't need it. There have been 4 dominant business models in the industry: fee-for-service hospital, underwriting-driven insurer, fee-for-service medical group, and blockbuster pharmaceutical model. That will change in the next 3 years. There has already started an explosion of new business models, and the questions for management teams are: what other models will emerge? How effective are they? What can we learn from them? Which ones do a great job for consumers and investors? And most importantly, which one would you invest in and why? When you're developing the 3 or 4 alternatives for what your next business model should be, ask your team or ask your employees who would invest in business model 1 versus 2 versus 3 versus 4. Eye-opening answers in that process. One of the things that investors are phenomenally interested in is not just profit and growth, but asset intensity. And if you take just a summary view of some of the models in the system today, for hospitals, the asset intensity is relatively high, and when you think of that, think of compulsory capital expenditures into the future. For care teams, the asset intensity is lower. For tech companies, the asset intensity might literally be 10 cents or 5 cents on the dollar. Very different margins, very different kinds of growth rate. If one is running a hospital system today, think of a future 3 years from now when I'm still on the first line versus a situation in which I have a hybrid position where half of me is still hospital, but half of me is care team, where the average margins are higher and where the growth rate is higher. Investors look at this scrupulously when they decide who to invest in, because 2 things matter for reinvestment. What are our margins, and what kinds of valuations allow us to raise capital to invent the new value propositions of tomorrow? We started off by asking who wins when industries converge. I know that there are a lot of presentations who ask a question and then wind up not answering it. I'm going to give a try. Who will win will be incumbents who pivot in a fast, focused way and who play aggressive defense, 30%, and aggressive offense, 70%. That was what Amazon, IBM, Samsung, and the others did. Who will win are the people who are the best understanders and fixers of hassle maps. It will be not all newcomers. There are hundreds of them, and 80 to 90% of them will fail. There will be the newcomers with the best business models. There will be the people who have mastered the art of collaboration, and the most aggressive exporters. Tech is one of our most competitive export industries. Think about the potential when you unite health with tech and the ability to create value not only for customers in the United States, but around the world. And, of course, the biggest winner, as they have been in retail, as they have been in tech, as they have been in the other industries, is the consumer. When these transitions occur, it's funny what the scarcest commodity in the system is. The scarcest commodity is leadership. When you look at who has won, it was not just great business design, not just great vision, it was leadership, but it was leadership in a very specific sense. If you talk to Lou Gerstner or Jong Young Yoon or the others, they will say, I have a huge responsibility at the top, but that is an incomplete description or definition of leadership. One CEO recently had a room of 500 managers, and she said, I'm going to give a very brief speech on leadership. When you think about leadership, don't look up, look in the mirror. Because if we are going to win, we need not one leader, but hundreds of terrific leaders in the organization. And we will invest to develop them, to expect leadership performance, and that's how we will win. And that's how they did win. I hope that some of these questions that we talked about this morning can get into your top management teams and debates so that they can alter the conversation in a way that focuses on creating an even more successful business model for tomorrow than the one that's made you successful so far.